All right, so just to start things out, want to very quickly welcome everybody to the second semester of Anatomy and Physiology. Um, I know that things have not gone the way that we originally had planned or thought that they would, and I honestly thought that by the time we got to summer session, we would be back face-to-face meetings. And they have decided that at least the first 2 weeks, so that's both of our class meetings for May, are still going to be online, and we are waiting to hear what they're going to do with June and July. So we're going to be picking up kind of where we left off with the video lectures and things of that nature for class. But there is going to be one difference from how things were at the end of spring semester. The biggest thing is we are going to pick back up with lab activities, and how that's going to work is I'm going to send kits home with you guys, and in the kits you will have the materials that you need to complete different lab activities so that we can reinforce the information that we are learning in each of the chapters with those lab activities. Now, within the kits, I have already put together a kit that has both of your labs for the cardiovascular system as well as the respiratory system. And if they come back and say that we are going to continue online into June, I will put together a second set of kits for you guys. And at that time, you'll exchange kit number 1 and pick up kit number 2. The kits, um, some of the materials that are going to be in the kits, I will eventually need back. So when you drop off one kit to pick up the other one, the expectation is you can get your second kit once you return the first one. And some of the materials I won't need back. And I will put a video post together kind of talking you through the lab activity, hopefully taking care of any of the common questions that we have with those labs. You can still always email me if questions come up. And I will tell you at that time what lab materials I do not expect back. Obviously, some are just consumed within the lab and you wouldn't need to return them. Others, depending on how far we go with this, there'll be some glassware and other materials that I would need back. So I will always let you know within a lab which items you can throw away when you're done and which ones I am going to need returned when the process is finished. And we'll just kind of work through that as we go. So right now you all have a set of lab kits waiting for you at Student Services, which is on the first floor of the building where we had our class meetings. I'm sure most of you are aware of that, but just in case somebody isn't. And Marty Lafferty, who is one of the first people you'll meet going into Student Services, she knows where the kits are. So just go in there and tell her that you are taking Anatomy and Physiology 2 and you have a kit to pick up and your name is on the top of the kit. So she'll grab that for you and send that home with you. The one thing that I'm going to ask with the kits, and I know that you have 2 labs that are in that first one. I put the direction sheets in there, but I am going to ask that you hold off on doing the actual lab until after the video lecture has been posted and you have had a chance to watch it. And the reason for that is the labs are meant to reinforce the things that we talk about. And if we haven't talked about it yet, some of the terminology, some of the goals of the lab are going to not be clear. And I don't think you will get as much out of doing the lab if you do it ahead of time versus if you wait until you've watched the video. The other thing is because we are not doing these in a face-to-face setting, I am going to have to make some modifications to the lab. So I sent you the materials, I sent you the lab directions as they initially come, but I am going to, like I said, change some things along the way just to make it easier for you to do it since you're doing it independently, which is going to alter some of the data and some of the information you're going to have to collect. So if you jump ahead and do the lab beforehand, there's the potential that you might have to go back and do it a second time because I'm going to maybe ask you to do it a little bit differently than what the directions state right now. The other thing is I gave you enough materials to run the labs one time. And if you have to do a repeat, there's a good chance you won't have the stuff you need to run it a second time. So please make sure that you are watching the videos first, listening to those directions that I lay out, and then making the changes that you need so that we don't run into those potential problems. Um, so right now you have one for the cardiovascular system and you have one for the respiratory system. And then, like I said, that'll get us through May, and hopefully by that time, we'll know what the rest of our summer session looks like. Now, with all of that said, we're going to start getting into our cardiovascular chapter. Cardiovascular chapter is going to work a little bit different. In the past, I've always just done one lecture and posted that for the entire chapter. I'm actually going to break this up into 2 video lectures. And the reason for that is we have a little bit different issue with the cardiovascular system in that we need to spend some time on the structures. And then we also need to pay attention to the blood because there's a lot going on with the blood and we need to focus on that as well. And so I want to break that up a little bit and have 2 video lectures that are shorter than one really long video lecture. So there will be 2 videos. Please make sure that you guys pay attention to that and that you get both of those taken care of during the week at some point in time. So the first one that I'm going to cover right now is going to be over the structures of the cardiovascular system. If you want to refer to it as the circulatory system, that works as well. They are both perfectly acceptable. So with the, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up the PowerPoint real fast. So with this particular packet, the first slide that you're looking at should say the size of the heart. And the size of the heart, it gives you the dimensions of 14 centimeters by 9 centimeters for an average heart. And when it talks about that, we don't really do a whole lot with centimeters. We work more in inches, and even at that, it's kind of hard for people to visualize. If you just ball up your hand and take a look at that, that's going to give you a pretty good indication of the size of your heart. So some of the structures that you can see in this particular heart, if you look at the very top, it kind of looks like there's just a mass of tissue sitting at the top of the heart. Those are actually the blood vessels that are extending off of the top part of the heart. So when blood leaves the heart for the last time and starts to make its way out to the different parts of the body, that is where it would make the exit. So in that massive tissue you have at the top, you actually have the aorta, and you also have the pulmonary blood vessels, the blood vessels that are going to route the blood from the heart back and forth to the lungs. So it's not just a massive tissue, those are actually blood vessels. If you look at the top right, you can see more of a blood vessel type structure there. The rest of it, just because of how it's positioned, it's very hard to visualize those blood vessels, but that's what they are. If you look at the actual surface of the heart, you'll notice that you have blood vessels that are kind of spidering and making their way across the surface of the heart. And it's important for people to remember that even though we know there's blood content on the inside of the heart, that the heart itself has cells that need to be taken care of just like every other cell of our body. They have to have an oxygen supply, they have to have nutrients, they have to have their waste product picked up. And so you can see those blood vessels that are serving all of those cells of the heart and making sure that that gets taken care of. The second slide that you have talks about the location of the heart, and you have the overlay of the rib cage so you can see exactly where those bones align with the heart. You can see that the sternum is going to lay over a good portion of the heart, but the part of the heart is going to extend over into the left cavity of the chest and gets good coverage from the ribs. But because of that part of the heart extending or moving into the left side, that we're going to have to make some accommodations there, because the other structure that you guys know is going to be very close in this region are the lungs. And you can see how there's a lot more space on the right side for a lung to be versus the left side. So the left lung is actually going to be smaller to accommodate that space that the heart needs, and it will actually change the number of lobes. Your right lung is going to have 3 total lobes, and the left lung, not having as much room, is only made up of 2 different lobes. And we'll get more into that when we get into our respiratory chapter. But I like this picture because it shows you the positioning of that diaphragm muscle. You can see how it kind of makes a dome right underneath the rib cage, where the lungs would be, and the positioning of the bones in relationship to the heart itself. So if you're doing chest compressions on somebody, you can see how the positioning of that sternum is going to help with those compressions and maintaining the function of the heart. Now, as we move into the next set of slides, I actually want you to look at the next 2 together because they go together. If you are more visual in your learning, The first slide that says visual of the wall of the heart, that's going to be more for you. But if you look at the slide that says walls of the heart, and you like to read things or write things out, this is kind of more for you. But it's the exact same information between those two slides. So I just want you to be aware that we're covering the same information two different ways. You can look at both of them, or you can focus on the one that works better for you. Now, one of the important things that I want you to pay attention to is the design of the body. There's a lot of repetition in the design in different places. And this is one of those times where we're actually going to see that design feature showing up. So you'll notice that there are 3 layers to the wall of the heart. You have the epi layer, the myo layer, and the endo layer. And I'm only referring to the prefix part of the word. I know it's endocardium, myocardium, epicardium, but I want you just to focus on the 3 prefixes, endo, myo, and epi. A lot of information contained in just those prefixes. And like I said, this is something that we're going to see in multiple places throughout the body as we move forward with the entire semester. So the epi layer is always going to be the outermost layer. If you think of the epidermis, that is the outer layer of skin. That's the one that you can see and touch. And so in these structures, anytime that you see epi, you know that that is the outermost layer to a particular structure. Endo indicates the internal or the inside layer. So that is going to be the innermost part you have of a structure. And then sandwiched in between, we have the myo. Myo always refers to muscle. So in these different body parts where we have this layering, you're going to have an outer layer, you're going to have an inner layer, and then sandwiched in between, we have a muscle layer. So when you see those 3 prefixes, that's what it's telling you. It's telling you the position, epi out, endo in, and myo is going to be in the middle, made of muscle. And then we typically are going to include a suffix part to the word. So we just went over the prefix. The suffix is going to indicate exactly where you are in the body. So in this particular case, we have the endocardium. The cardium is going to be our suffix indicating cardi, which is heart. So when you put the 2 together, it tells you the location. It also tells you exactly where you're at in the body. Now, the reason that I point this out is because when we get into blood vessels, when we get into the uterus, when we get into the intestinal tract, these are all places where you're going to see the same design show up time and time again. 3 layers, epi, endo, and a muscle layer in between. And so I just kind of wanted to point that out a little bit more in this talk so that it kind of sticks in your brain as it comes up throughout the later chapters. You'll remember kind of that positioning. Now, for the next slide, it talks about the 4 chambers of the heart. And this is going to go back to our anatomical identification, our anatomical position. When you look at this, the right terms appear to be on the left side of the page. They are, but remember, when we're referring to the heart, we are talking about how those structures actually are positioned in the body, not how you're looking at it on the page. So I have put these 4 chambers of the heart in the same way that they would be if you were looking at an image of the heart. So the right atrium would be basically the top left. And I just wanted to clarify that because it's been a while since we've talked about anatomical term, anatomical position. But this is how it would be identified within the heart. So 4 chambers of the human heart. And the top 2 chambers are referred to as the atria. The bottom 2 chambers are going to be the ventricles. And with the 4 chambers of the heart, the blood is going to be different in the 4 chambers because of what we're trying to do. When blood comes back to the heart, it's traveled throughout the body. So it's made one full circle through the body. And in its travels through the body, the blood has been delivering oxygen to all of your cells. We're trillions of cells in size. It's been delivering nutrients to your cells. And it's also been picking up the waste product, that carbon dioxide that your cells have been making through the work that they're doing. So we have this exchange. The blood is delivering good stuff to your cells, and it's picking up the bad stuff that your cells have made and cleaning them out. So when the blood gets back to the heart, it's going to have lower levels of oxygen because it just got done delivering it to your cells, and it's going to have high levels of carbon dioxide. And so we need to get that blood prepared to go back out to your body again. So when the blood initially comes back to the heart, it's only going to travel through 2 chambers of the heart before it leaves. Will eventually come back to the final 2 chambers of your heart, and then it goes back out to the body. And a lot of people just assume that it goes to the heart, goes through all 4 chambers, and goes back out. And that's not the way that it works. Okay. So the blood is going to come back to the heart, and the first chamber that it goes to is going to be the right atrium. It comes back to the right atrium through the superior and the inferior vena cava. Now, the superior vena cava is going to come into the top part of the heart. So it comes into the top part of the right atrium. The inferior vena cava actually comes in from the bottom. So the terms superior and inferior tell you actually a couple of different things. Where it's positioned in the chamber of the heart, superior is on the top side, inferior is on the bottom side. But it also tells you where it's bringing blood back from. So the superior is going to bring blood back from the upper part of the superior parts of your body. The inferior is going to bring blood back from the lower parts of your body. And so you get a little bit of information about where it's bringing the blood back and where it's actually attached to the chamber of the heart. You'll notice that it's identified as being low in O2, which should make sense. We just talked about it's been traveling through the body, it's been delivering its oxygen content, so it's going to be on the lower side. It's not out completely, but it's going to be depleted. Now, from the right atrium, the next time that your heart beats, there's a trap door between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And when the heart is at rest, that trap door is closed and it holds the blood in your right atrium. But when the heart beats, it forces the trap doors open and the blood is allowed to move from the right atrium down into the right ventricle. Now, I refer to it as a trap door. It's a valve. And the valve that is going to separate your right atrium from your right ventricle is known as the tricuspid valve. We call it the tricuspid valve because there are 3 flaps that make up the valve. And when the heart beats, it pulls those valves open. Blood is allowed to advance forward into the right ventricle. When the heart rests, those doors close back up to make sure that the blood stays where it's supposed to. Now, once the blood is in the right ventricle, the reason that we travel it to the right ventricle is because the ventricles, the lower part of the heart, have very, very thick muscles. So when they contract, they are able to push the blood with a lot more force than what the atria can. Atria just have to get it down into the bottom chamber of the heart. But once we have it in that ventricle, now it's going somewhere. And so we need those thick muscles in the ventricle part of the heart to force that blood, give it a good push to get it to where it's going. From the right ventricle, the next time that the heart beats, we're actually going to send that blood out from the right ventricle to what are known as your pulmonary blood vessels. Pulmonary indicates lungs, so the blood is actually leaving the heart and it's going to go to the lungs. Once the blood goes to the lungs, this is where the blood is going to pick up more oxygen, and it's also going to get rid of that carbon dioxide that it picked up from your cells. So there's a gas exchange going on. We're getting in more O2, and we are getting rid of that waste product, the carbon dioxide. So that gas exchange happens in the lungs. We get the blood or the O2 levels built back up, and now the blood is ready to go back out to the body. So we send it from the lungs back to the heart, again through our pulmonary vessels. The pulmonary vessels are going to deliver the blood to the left atrium. The left atrium is then going to hold the blood until the heart beats. And again, between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have another trap door. Now on this side of the heart, that trap door is called either the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve. You can use either one. They are both perfectly acceptable. Bicuspid does indicate the fact that there's just two flaps on this side. So blood returns to the heart. It's held in the left atrium. The heart beats, forces that trap door open. The blood is able to advance from the left atrium down into the left ventricle. And now we're back into that bottom part of the heart. We've got those thick muscles around the ventricles so that when the heart beats, now the blood is going to be forced out of the heart into the aorta. And the aorta is going to branch into a bunch of different blood vessels and disperse the blood back out through all the parts of the body. Some of it will go to the head, some of it goes to the arms, the core, down to the legs, and getting that blood back out to where it needs to be to continue to take care of our cells. So it's a process of getting that blood back to the heart, traveling it through just the right side, getting the push we need from the ventricle to get it out to the lungs so a gas exchange can happen. Gas exchange happens in the lungs. We bring it back to the heart, into the left atrium, down to that left ventricle. And now that left ventricle, again, using those thick muscles, when it contracts, takes that blood and forces it out to all the parts of the body. The next slide that we have talks about the four major valves that we would see in the heart, and I talked about two of them already. We identified the tricuspid valve and where it would be located, the mitral valve, or if you want to refer to that as the bicuspid, but you get the explanation of where those are. The other two valves that we have in the heart are the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. Now, the pulmonary valve is going to be between the right ventricle and the pulmonary vessels. And the aortic valve is going to be in between the left ventricle and the aorta. Now, we place valves strategically in places that we really need to make sure blood is kept moving in a forward direction. So anytime that we have, or any place that we have a valve in the body, what we are doing is we are making sure that when the heart beats, those valves open up and allow the blood to advance. When the heart rests, those valve doors close so that blood can't back up and move somewhere it's always been. So blood flow is always going to be kept moving in a forward direction. The next slide that you guys have talks about the blood movement through the heart. And this is one of those pictures that when you initially look at it, it kind of looks very scary. You've got a lot going on. You've got arrows going in all sorts of different directions. You've got all of these labels. Kind of don't focus on the words too much right now. What I want you to do is I want you to draw two rectangles on this picture, and they're going to overlap a little bit. That's okay. But I want you to draw one rectangle that's going to be kind of wider, and I want you in that rectangle to include three things: the right lung, the heart, the left lung. So put a box around those three structures. The two lungs and the heart are the only three things that need to be in that rectangle. The second rectangle, I want you to draw, so it's going to be a little bit taller rectangle. Draw that one and don't include the lungs. You have a cluster of capillaries at the top. They're called the systemic capillaries. You have the heart in the middle, and then at the bottom, you have another set of systemic capillaries. Your second rectangle should be around those three items. Like I said, they will overlap a little bit in the middle. That's okay. What this picture is actually trying to show you is the two circuits we have for blood movement through the body. One is called the pulmonary circuit. The other one is called the systemic circuit. Now, that wide rectangle that I had you draw that included the two lungs and the heart, that is your pulmonary circuit. That involves any blood flow between the lungs and the heart. So whether it's going to the lungs or from the lungs back to the heart, either way, that is our pulmonary circuit. The other way that includes the heart and the capillaries, and I know it shows or focuses the capillaries, but really it's all the blood vessels of the body. But that is going to be our systemic circuit. That is going to be the blood flow that takes the blood out to all the systems of the body. And so systemic circuit, pulmonary circuit. The next slide that you guys have talks about blood flow through the heart. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. Typically, I would take you through this step by step if we were meeting face to face in class, but I'm not going to talk through that. Like I said, I know where I'm going to go with this one, but we're not going to do it right this second. So you will eventually come back to that slide. Don't need it right now. The next slide that you have talks about the sounds of the heart. And the sounds of the heart, when you listen to a heartbeat, there are two different sounds. And the first one is known as a lub-dub sound or lub sound. And then the second one is the dub sound. And what you're actually hearing when you hear those two sounds of a heartbeat is which set of valves are closing. So that first sound that you hear in a heartbeat are the valves. They're called the AV valves or atrioventricular. These are the valves that are found between the atria and the ventricles. That's where the A and the V come from. So the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves. When they close, you can actually hear that. It results in a noise, and that's going to be the first part of the heartbeat. The second part of the heartbeat is when those valves in the pulmonary vessels and the aorta are closing. And so the first heartbeat, like I said, you hear the first sound of the heartbeat are those valves between the top and bottom chambers. The second part of the heartbeat is going to be the valves in those big blood vessels serving the heart. If you get a third noise or an alternate noise other than just those two, that is typically what we would call a murmur. And that is going to be an indication that a valve is not closing the way that it's supposed to. And so blood is not running the direction that it's supposed to. You get some extra blood movement, and that's going to result in a third noise that you can detect within the heart. The next one that we have talks about heart conduction. And your heartbeat is actually going to be an electrical impulse. And this kind of shows you how that electrical impulse is going to move through the heart. So if you look at the top left, there's an SA node and an AV node. The SA is the sinoatrial node, and then you have the AV, which is the atrioventricular node. Now, what happens is you have this impulse that is going to be sent from the brain. And if you think about that electrical impulse as it's coming from the brain and it's making its way to the heart, look at the location of those two nodes. The SA node is at the top of the right atrium. The AV node is at the bottom of the right atrium. So if you're thinking about an impulse that is coming from the brain down to the heart, which one of those nodes would that electrical impulse get to first? If you're looking at the positioning of it from the brain down, it's going to hit that SA node first. So when the electrical impulse from the brain hits that SA node, it starts that electrical impulse through the heart, and you'll notice those fibers run through what two chambers? They run through the atria. That's going to cause those atria to contract. The force of the atria contracting is going to push those valve doors open, so both the tricuspid and the bicuspid, pushes them open, and blood goes from the top chamber to the bottom two chambers of the heart. Now, split second later, doesn't take very long, but it's just enough time. Those electrical impulses are going to continue to make their way down, and now a split second later, they finally get to that AV node. When that happens, it causes the ventricles to contract. And when they contract, they push the pulmonary valve open, they push the aortic valve open, and now the blood moves forward into those two blood vessels. So we have the top part of the heart contracting slightly before the bottom part of the heart, just to keep that blood flow moving the way that it's supposed to. Now, the next part talks about the electrocardiogram. I'm actually going to move that into our next lecture. So I want you to take a look very quickly at the blood pressure slide. When we talk about blood pressure, and when you go to the doctor's office, they will take your blood pressure and they will tell you what your blood pressure is. And we like blood pressure to be at 120/80. That's our goal target of where we're trying to get it to be. A lot of times there's not a whole lot of explanation behind what that information actually is. So when we talk about blood pressure, we are talking about the amount of force that is being put on the walls of your blood vessels when the heart beats and when the heart is at rest. So as that blood is going through your blood vessels, the blood is not going to move just forward, it's also going to push out. And as it pushes out, it's going to push up against the walls of your blood vessels. Now, again, when we think of that pressure, things only work if you can push back with the same amount of force that's being pushed out. Balloons are always a good example. You start blowing up a balloon, you're putting air into the balloon, and as you force air into the balloon, the walls of the balloon start to expand. And as long as the walls of the balloon can push back with the same amount of force as the air you're pushing in, balloon stays together. But as soon as you put enough air into that balloon that the walls of the balloon can't push back with the same amount of force, what happens? Balloon explodes. The air was pushing out with more force than what the balloon could come back with, and it caused the balloon to rupture. The same sort of design in our blood vessels. That blood is pushing up against the walls of our blood vessels, just like the air is pushing up against the walls of the balloon. If the blood vessels can come back with the same amount of force, everything's fine. But if it gets to a point where the blood pushes out with more force than the blood vessels can come back with, the blood vessels rip open. And that's why we worry about blood pressure. The top number is going to tell us how much force is being applied when the heart beats. So it should always be higher than the bottom number. The bottom number is going to tell us how much force is being applied to those blood vessel walls when the heart is at rest. And some people think that that number should be much lower or should be zero if the heart is at rest, that there shouldn't be any pressure. But if you have a cup of water sitting on your tabletop, even though the water is not moving in your cup or in your water bottle, that water is still putting some amount of force on the walls of that cup or that water bottle. And so there is still going to be some amount of pressure there. So the blood pressure value should be 120 over 80. That's acceptable. When it starts getting higher than that, that's telling us that the amount of force on those blood vessel walls is going up. And it's more and more likely that it's going to get to a point those blood vessel walls just can't come back with the same amount of force. Top number is called systolic, and the bottom number is known as our diastolic number. So when you get into the terminology for that, systolic refers to that top number that we would like to see at 120. Diastolic refers to that bottom number, which we would like to see around 80. All right, so that concludes our first conversation. Like I said, we are going to have two for this week, and I will come back with a blood one, and then I will also have a short one that will kind of take you through the lab and what you need to do for that. If questions come up, please let me know, and I will get those answered as quickly as I can for you. Still, even through the summer, the Sioux City Schools email is going to get you a quicker response. I will make sure and post that so that you guys have that and can communicate that way. And then the St. Luke's email, I will be checking that as well, just not quite as often as the Sioux City School email address.